Hello everyone. Just to say welcome to the session. This is our opportunity really to share with you a whole body of knowledge that's been developing over the last 2 years as part of a program of work around assessment of feedback and the role that technology has in enhancing those processes. I'm Lisa Gray. I'm the program manager for the program, and I'm presenting today with my colleague Marianne, as well as my other colleague Jill Ferrell, who's the synthesis consultant for the program. But we're also fortunate enough to have 4 of the institutions from the program with us who will also be sharing some of their experiences. So we're not going to be able to cover everything today given the breadth of work. So we're focusing on highlighting some of the assessment of feedback challenges that emerged out of the initial body of work. And we'll touch on 4 of the key themes from that have emerged from the program. Those key themes are aligned with a series of briefing papers that we'll be launching today. And we'll give you details of those in a little while. But the main themes focus around the role of change in assessment of feedback practices through a principled-led approach. We'll also touch on assessment and employability, feedback and feed-forward, and the role that technology has to play in supporting that, but also electronic assessment management and how technology can support those processes around the assessment management lifecycle. So just to give you a little bit of context about the work, we started off in 2011. Jisc is for those who aren't familiar with Jisc, we're a body that supports the use of digital technologies in UK higher education, further education and skills. And we funded this work to take place over a 2 to 3 year period. It's involved over 20 projects and across 40 different UK higher education institutions, based down from Cornwall up to Dundee over to Belfast. There were 3 main strands of work. The first strand focused around institutional change, the second around looking at evidencing and evaluating existing technology innovations around assessment and feedback, and the third was a smaller number of projects that were looking specifically at technology transfer and making more widely available some technologies that have been used within particular contexts. But overall, across the whole program, there's been a very strong emphasis on the educational rationale for enhancing learning and teaching through technology, as well as delivering efficiencies and quality improvements across the board. So I'll start with going right back to the beginning. Back in 2011, we asked all of the institutional change projects to baseline their starting points. And this was for a number of reasons, but mainly to articulate the state of play, so have a point of measurement at which we could return back to see the journey and the direction of travel. The baselines overall showed a number of pockets of good practice, but overall a really consistent picture of the challenges that were being faced, and also highlighted the problems that exist with, in particular, resistance to change and the scaling up of good practice and innovation that were happening in pockets. In terms of assessment of feedback strategy and policy, we found that strategy documents tended to be quite procedural in focus and didn't really reflect the current thinking around assessment practice and the value that assessment can bring to learning. And a related and other key issue was that the devolved responsibility for assessment and feedback across faculties and service departments resulted in considerable inconsistencies, which was making it very difficult to achieve a parity of experience for learners, which is a concern. In terms of academic practice, the issues were varied, but included the emphasis on summative assessment over formative assessment, as I'm sure you would anticipate, and the persistence of traditional forms of assessment such as essays and exams, even though there might have been a wide variety of opportunities available. There were an issue around a lack of developmental focus with the feedback, and that came in part due to the timeliness as well as the quality and the consistency of feedback. And there's an issue across the board around those issues. And even where clear deadlines were set for particular assignments, they didn't always arrive in time to feed into the next assignment and enable learners to learn in a continual and developmental way. And related to that, curriculum design issues can also provide barriers to the ongoing developmental approach where, assessment and feedback are happening in modular circumstances and not necessarily being looked at a program level. And fourthly, there's issues around the world of work, and so we found that assessment and feedback processes, particularly around the emphasis on summative, high-stakes assessment and the value that's placed on marks and grades, was very different to the more formative ways that professionals develop during their working lives, where there might be multiple audiences and multiple stakeholders involved in developing over time. And fifthly, there was a perception that learners weren't engaging with the feedback that they received. Tutors may have felt that they've given a lot of feedback, but that wasn't always acted on, or certainly there was a perception that that hasn't been acted on. And learners were seen as passive and waiting for the feedback to be delivered to them. But the reality was really less clear-cut than that. Often the value of acting on feedback wasn't well communicated, absent from, for example, induction processes, and also those issues that we've already mentioned around the timeliness, the clarity of feedback that could have been posing barriers in that way. So that was a really quick overview of some of the challenges that were raised across the board through those baseline processes. And we're just interested now to get a quick indication from you about what you see as being the biggest issue within your own contexts. So if you just go to the poll for me and please select one of the 5 issues that I've just touched on there as being key to you. Okay, that's great, thank you. Just a few more there. Jill, all you'll need to do to respond to the poll is just below your name in the participants box, there's a little row of boxes. One of those has an A on it, and if you go to that A and select the letter. Okay, and if we can just get a bit of a sense of what that's looking like. Okay, interesting. So traditional practices dominating, as well as the learners in that passive role. That's really interesting. Thank you. Okay, I'm now going to hand over to Jill, who's going to cover some of the ways in which the projects have dealt with these issues and some of the themes that have arisen from that work.
Hello everyone. I'm going to talk through, yes, some of the findings from the individual projects. I apologise if I croak and cough and splutter a little bit through this. Interesting to see the results of the polls. Yes, traditional practices dominating and passive learners seem to be key issues for you. We actually will be talking later about some briefings that we're producing out of the programme. There is one on change management because these issues do seem to be very, very common throughout the sector. Moving back to the slides, then the really key thing to start with, I guess, is why are we doing all of this in the first place? What are we trying to achieve through assessment and feedback? What's the vision for it all? Because a key message from the programme was that we needed to make sure that the pedagogy was actually driving the use of technology rather than the other way round. And there was a collective view that there's a real need to talk within your institutions about what is considered to be good educational practice. It needs to be surfaced and articulated as a foundation for moving forward, not least because, as Lisa said, that some of the strategy and policy making can actually be quite devolved. And one tried and tested way of doing this is by defining a set of values or principles that describe what the educational experience should be in your institution. We worked with Professor David Nicol as an advisor to the project. He's done a lot of work to the program, sorry. He's done a lot of work in this area. And the links on this slide point to some of Professor Nicol's work and to some other well-used and well-established sets of principles. Many of our projects started out by trying to benchmark themselves against some of these well-known sets of principles. Others had already come from a starting point where they had done considerable work and reflection themselves in terms of defining their own principles. And the University of Hertfordshire, as an example, who defined a set of assessment for learning principles, it is an example that will crop up as we're talking. So principles can be useful as a kind of common ground between different disciplines and approaches, a common language, an educational framework for moving forward with innovation and actually evaluating the results. So in some ways they're a kind of shorthand that can sum up a lot of evidence-based research that not all academics have a chance to read. But they're certainly not an easy or lazy way out, and it's not something that stands still. Many projects found that the dialogue around their principles was as important in changing culture and practices as the end result. And they also found that their thinking evolved over time. In particular, we found throughout the life of the program that evidence relating to the value of peer review appears to corroborate much of the newer research literature. And it's by no means an easy thing to get right, because in coming up with principles, you've got to be able to gain widespread support for them, yet they still have to challenge current thinking. They've still got to demand action and change rather than a nodding acceptance that this is a good thing. And actually implementing the principles was an interesting voyage of discovery for the project, because a principle that sounds simple and sound, such as clarify what constitutes good performance, when you come to implement it, you can do so on a spectrum that goes from doing it in a very teacher-led way to doing it in a way that's much more learning-centric. And something that we'll see more of later. But having kind of thrown in the idea of principles, I think I'd just like to do another poll and ask the people in the room, does your institution, or are you aware that your institution has a defined set of principles for assessment and feedback? It's a yes and no response, so if you look underneath where you see your name, you should see either a tick for yes or a cross for no. I think most people have responded. Give you another couple of seconds and then Marianne will miraculously display the results on screen for us. Interesting comment in the chat box there. Yes for assessment, not for feedback. I think that's something that we'll be coming back to as well, Susan. Yeah. So 46% of you do. And there are other grey areas for some of the others. What we saw within the program were some excellent examples of how institutions have gone about putting their principles into practice and some of the lessons that they learned. The diagram here is from Queen's University Belfast, and it's trying to show how each of its individual assessment and feedback principles supports an overarching aim, which is to encourage positive motivational beliefs and self-esteem. And the colour coding in the diagram is because they're actually supporting that with a whole range of resources, guidance, decision trees to help with using technology that all map back to the agreed set of principles for the institution. Now, we're fortunate to have Anne Jones from Queen's with us today. I think at this point I will just hand over to Anne and ask her to say a little bit more about how they did put their principles into practice.
Thank you, Jill. We've been working with these are the REAP principles, or some of them, that David Nichols developed. And we've been using these before we started with the Jisc project that we've been working on, as a means of organising good practice that we'd found around the university in terms of assessment and feedback. So these had already been sort of inculcated into our thinking. And as Jill says, we've colour-coded them so that we can then map current assessment and feedback practices and then look at how they map against the redesigns of those within schools and subject areas taking part in the project. But right from the beginning we were interested in what is there as good practice already. And so we've had an overarching approach to the project, which is appreciative inquiry. Now this is something that was developed by Cooper Ryder and Whitney back in 2005, and involves 4 stages around a central core question. Stages of discovery, dreaming, designing and delivery. And so obviously our core question or aim is the educational principles for assessment and feedback. And so with each of our schools and subject areas that we have been working with, we start with a baselining, which is finding out the discovery of what's currently going on within the school or subject area in terms of its assessment and feedback. And part of that is to identify the good practice against the principles. And then we move into a workshop with the program teams around their assessment and feedback highlight stories to discover from them what they as individuals consider to have been their highlights, either as assessors giving feedback or on the receiving end of assessment and feedback. And they tell each other stories, and then those stories are shared. And what comes out of that within each group is often a very common set, common ethos among the group. But this is also the first time that they've really talked about these things, and so we're building this dialogue. I came across a sentence in a paper recently from Teaching in Higher Education, and whilst it had nothing to do with appreciative inquiry, it really does sum up what it's about. And let me just quote it. Whilst we may begin with autobiography, we must then move to a sharing of those stories as a way to build community. And that's what we're finding that we're doing with our colleagues in the schools. So having shared those stories, we then ask them to dream. Where do they want their assessment and feedback landscape to be in 2 or 3 years' time? And from that, they then receive a draft literature review where we pull through the principles, we synthesize the literature on assessment and feedback and how technology has been used to support it, providing evidence. And then that's followed by a further workshop where we plan with them, that we demonstrate much of the technology that we have available within the institution, how it can be used, and then plan with them the activities that they're going to undertake over the following year, during the following academic year, to achieve their dreams. And those are mapped again against the educational principles. And we have sets of cards that have the educational principles on them, different ways in which they can be achieved, different technologies that can support those aims. But also we have a set of technology cards which set out what they need in terms of equipment or whatever, what the benefits are for staff and students, and the different options available to them to use that. And so we developed that action plan that really has the educational principles that we work with set at the very focus of it. And then they move into developing those activities over the sort of the summer term, summer months, for delivery and rollout the following academic year. And then we go through a process of evaluating and reviewing and building on what they've been doing and where that's going to take them in the subsequent year. So embedding, sustaining the developments that have been taking place. And I'll hand back to Jill.
Thank you, Anne. Yeah, lovely example there of a really rounded and well-supported approach that's certainly not standardized or one size fits all, but fits with the needs of each of the schools. And just to highlight maybe one or two other examples of people who are doing similar things, we talked earlier about how the same principle could be implemented across a spectrum of ways that could be either teacher-centric or learning-centric. The University of Ulster was very conscious of this, and it's done some excellent work, actually funded under the Jisc curriculum design program rather than this one, that's produced a fantastic set of staff development resources. It's a simple workshop-based approach and talked about sharing stories, and this is really the same kind of thing. It's just an easy and flexible way to stimulate dialogue and to stimulate thinking at the right point in the curriculum design process. The cards that the Viewpoints project produced and the instructions for running the workshops are freely available for others to use. They've actually been tried and tested in very, very many institutions across the UK, and we've heard very, very positive feedback about the value of this tool. So please do take a look at that. Finally, I get to mention technology, and again, some lovely examples of resources that projects have used to try and help people make good technology choices based on the type of learning and teaching approach that they're trying to implement. An example here from the University of Exeter, who took the popular Top Trumps card game, and they've produced Tech Trumps that show how different technologies that are in common use can actually support some of the underlying principles in their efforts to introduce more work-integrated assessment across the institution. Again, Queen's has done something similar, Winchester's done something similar, and there are links to all of the tools that they've made available in the design studio. Moving on to the second of the main themes of today's webinar, employability was a major topic for many of the projects in the programme, particularly Cornwall College, the University of Exeter and Manchester Metropolitan University. Now, whenever we come to talk about this in a group of academics, it always turns into a debate about the true value and the purpose of education. And whatever conversations I think we might have around these topics, we can't ignore the fact that the notion that study leads, HE level study in particular, leads to improved employability prospects is currently of major importance to students, to their parents, and to senior management. And the projects looked at this from a perspective of trying to address some very real problems that some of the traditional assessment methods that, again, you've corroborated today, many of you are still using, such as essays, such as an emphasis on summative assessment, aren't really preparing students as well as they could be for the world of work. They don't really reflect how professionals develop during the course of their working life. In the real world, we find that acquiring and making sense of feedback, in particular from a range of sources, giving feedback to colleagues, are all essential skills. Sometimes even just understanding what the customer wants is the difficult part, and it brings into question at times some of the emphasis we have on grading and marking criteria and rubrics. And sometimes the issue is simply that the students are developing these skills, but they don't quite recognize it for themselves, and they're not really able to articulate the skills that they're actually developing. The University of Exeter brought together the idea of educational principles and values and employability in developing a model to help ensure that its assessment and feedback practice was developing appropriate competencies in its learners, and that it was helping the learners to actually show that they had those competencies. In some ways, actually developing the model was easier than deciding what to call it. They started out talking about authentic assessment. They went through a range of other terms, including contextual, alternative, situated, experiential. All of them had flaws in certain ways. All of them were controversial in particular subjects, and they ended up deciding to call the model work integrated assessment. I realise that you probably can't see very much of it on the screen here. It's really just an overview to highlight that the dimensions of the model are things like peer review, collaborative working, understanding your audience, and they're there to help ensure that assessments are structured in such a way as to evidence these skills. The different coloured blobs in the middle show how a single design has actually evolved through a process of review and quality assurance. It's probably easiest, I think, to show an example of how it's impacted actual practice. Good example is one of their psychology modules, where the original assessment that they had planned was a written exam. Using the model, they redesigned this so that the main assessment became a collaboratively designed flyer. And the students had to work with two, what they termed, external audiences. One was a lived experience group consisting of people with mental health issues, and the other was the university's own wellbeing service for students. What this pie chart shows is the outcomes of a student evaluation where they were asked to identify what they'd learned from that particular module. And I think it shows you quite clearly that there's a link between the revised module structure and the development of some of those key professional skills that they were really intending to be the learning outcomes of the module. Another key means of developing some of the skills required in the world of work is peer review. And peer review activities weren't a major feature of the program overall, but they were one of the really big success stories where people were working in this area. There are some very good examples. It was the major focus of University of Edinburgh's project, which was using the open source Peerwise tool. It was also important in piloting the use of an approach called MAC, Making Assessment Count, that was developed at the University of Westminster and then rolled out across a number of other different institutions. What they found was that a combination of self-reflection and peer review seems to give the best results in terms of enhancing learning. And the final report from this project was very, very emphatic about the fact that peer review was the element of the approach that really had the best alignment with their assessment for learning principles. And this corroborates much of the recent research that David Nichol has published, in which he suggests that self-reflection needs to be supported by an external element, and that evaluating other pieces of work completed to the same assignment brief is an immensely powerful way of achieving this. One brief note of caution, and especially from the MAC implementation project, is the importance of good induction for students to ensure that they really understand the purpose and the value of peer review activities. Because the idea that you go to college or university to learn from an expert seems to be deeply ingrained in the student psyche. And it feels as if we as educators aren't really helping students to make the connection between activities such as peer review that might be quite unfamiliar and uncomfortable to some of them, make the connection between those activities and the competences that they really need for their future employment. Moving to the third of our main themes, then one of the biggest shifts we saw throughout the program was in the balance from summative to formative assessment, and hence in assessment of learning rather than, assessment for learning rather than assessment of learning. It was a key objective for many projects who were looking at learner longitudinal development, feeding forward, and iterative approaches whereby feedback acknowledges progress against the learner's previous performance, regardless of any kind of achievement against an external benchmark. And although this is very much a learning design issue, technology also has a vital role to play here in terms of enabling the storage of feedback across a program and making it easily accessible to both staff and students in order that they can develop a long-term picture. What we found is that most of the VLEs in common use are recording marks and feedback at a module level. It's not easy to gain this kind of overview at a program level. Other projects such as the HEA PASS project that's just produced its final report has been looking at this issue as well. The design of the curriculum does of course need to permit this type of development, and some of the common problems that Lisa highlighted earlier are the lack of formative opportunities or the lack of time for feedback to inform the next assignment. And the diagram here shows an immensely useful tool that's known as assessment timelines, developed by the University of Hertfordshire, and it's been picked up and used again by many other institutions. The approach of mapping your existing practice against a timeline to see where improvements can be made, very, very simple, but very, very powerful. The example here is a before and after timeline from a program at the University of Dundee. And what these types of analysis and other analytical data produced by the program showed is that over-assessment and assessment bunching has an adverse effect on student attainment. Now this might seem like a glimpse of the obvious, but what we've got from the program is hard evidence for something that to date has been viewed as gut feeling or common sense. It's nice to actually have data to back that up. Manchester Metropolitan University in particular undertook some large-scale research with 37,000 students. I think anything they do is large-scale, and they've presented some very, very good data about how over-assessment has an adverse impact on student performance. And simply collecting and looking at data about assessment and feedback has been revealing in many ways. In MMU's case, they were quite shocked to find that at peak times they could be dealing with 13,000 assignments in a week, which has all sorts of implications for their administrative and IT support systems, as well as for their learners. And a reduction in summative assessment helped to alleviate this. Another university that's been working in that area, University of South Wales, formerly Glamorgan, has been looking at this. We have Karen Fitzgibbon with us today, and I'd like to now hand over to Karen to talk about how they've been using the technology to improve student use of feedback.
Thanks, Jill. Hope everyone can hear me okay. The assessment diaries that we developed at Glamorgan were essentially a simple list of modules and titles, dates for assessment and submission and return of feedback. The information is posted on the VLE. We used Blackboard at the time, and the diary was developed using an in-house web-based front end, which is provided within Blackboard and allows students or enables students to personalize their assessment calendar, but it also is accessible by tutors. So it gives them clear, easily accessible information about when assignments are to be submitted and returned. And for both groups, both students and staff, there are a series of automated reminders. So the staff get reminders if the diary hasn't been populated for their module, just to remind them that the information is missing and to ask them to go and populate it. The students get reminders 2 weeks before the submission date to prepare them to make sure that they're aware that the assessment is due, 1 week before, and also on the day of the submission itself. Our project as part of the assessment and feedback was to actually evaluate these tools, the assessment diary and the use of GradeMark to provide online feedback to students had actually been introduced across the university as a result of a Change Academy project called Assessment at the Heart of Learning, as a result of which we'd developed a policy of assessment for learning. And the Jisc project that I worked on with Dr. Alice Lau, who's now at Plymouth University, was to evaluate the experiences of both staff and students in the use of the assessment diaries and GradeMark. So just to give you a very quick flavour of some of the outcomes, we asked students what their expectations were in terms of the medium through which they would expect to receive assessment deadlines. 36% of the students that were involved in the study expected the deadlines to be sent via email, which actually they wouldn't have received at Glamorgan. That would have been an odd practice. And 48% of them said they expected it to come through a variety of channels, sometimes repeating the information. But there were very few who actually expected it to come in this online single format where they could see everything at a glance. In terms of the student experience, there's a lot more in the final report on our pages in the design studio. But again, just to give you a flavour, the level of awareness amongst the students of the phrase assessment diary was actually quite low. But when Alice and I talked to the students in the focus groups, it was very clear that they were actually using assessment diaries, they just didn't call them that. And they said how much it helped them to plan their time and also to make the use of feedback that they'd received from earlier assessments, because it allowed them to see the connections between one assessment and another, even across modules on a course. They also commented on the information accuracy, but also pointed out the impact of poor information. So if information was missing or if it was found to be inaccurate, there was a real a match to the extent of concern that then caused and the amount of doubt in the entire tool that led to. So Alice and I did a lot of work as a result of that particular piece of feedback to reinforce to staff how important it is to be accurate in the information that goes into the diaries. As a result, we also found out that students were actually having what they called feedback parties, because the assessment diary told them the date and the time at which they would receive their feedback, and they would be online all together in a sort of a chat forum, waiting for that clock to tick down before the feedback was released. And they started calling them feedback parties, which was, we just thought that was a really nice sort of aspect of the students actually becoming involved much more than the Lisa mentioned at the beginning, how students sometimes are seen as passive about receiving feedback. there was very much a culture of, no, I'm waiting for my feedback, and if it's not there, I want to know where it's disappeared. We actually asked students how many of them received the feedback on the date they were informed they would be given it. 66% of them said back that they received their feedback on time. 34% said they received it a little bit late, but we knew from a previous study that as long as they were informed that it would be late, that they would then accept that information. So back to you, Jill.
Thanks. I noticed we have got one very quick question before we move on. Did they actually discuss the feedback during their feedback parties?
Yes, that was a really nice part of it. They were willing to tell each other what they had, much more than our previous information would have suggested, that the students who did well would share that, but the students who did less well wouldn't. Whereas in the feedback parties, they were sharing much more how they'd done.
Thanks. Interesting to hear that students are discussing their feedback, because one of the things that I found most astonishing that we revealed in the program was the lack of discussion in program teams that seems to take place. It kind of, I think it was reflected in some of the responses to the earlier polls, that assessment seems to be better defined and structured than feedback. And certainly when the Institute of Education was looking to implement a more longitudinal approach, they talked about feedback as taking place in a black box, and that seems to be an experience that's borne out elsewhere. But the focus of QA type activities seems to be exclusively on comparing and moderating marks, and there's little, if any, discussion within program teams about individual approaches to feedback. I see somebody comment that it is so varied, but if there isn't that discussion, it's unsurprising that students talk about inconsistency in what they receive. And another of the really valuable pieces of the evidence base from this program is a range of audits that institutions took using different tools and different methods, but looking at the types of feedback that they were giving. A number of the projects have produced tools for profiling and analysing feedback, and many of those you can find in the Design Studio. This is an example of the tool that the IOE used. What's interesting about these audits as a whole is that all of the institutions who undertook analyses found that their feedback appeared to be skewed in particular ways rather than balanced. Now, precisely how it was skewed varied according to the subject, the institutional context, but most of it seemed to be short-term rather than truly developmental. And the value, rather than pick out any of the differences, that the value really was in the eye-opening that occurred and the kind of dialogue that it stimulated. We have Gwyneth Hughes from the Institute of Education with us today, and I'd like to hand over now to ask Gwyneth to talk a little bit more about the outcomes of their audit.
Thank you, Jill. I hope everyone can hear. Yes, our project we've called Assessment Careers because we particularly wanted to look at the longitudinal approach to encourage students to take action on their feedback across a program rather than only within modules. And the reason we came up with this tool is because we didn't really know what kind of feedback students were receiving. I mean, in their written feedback, or indeed in their verbal feedback, and we wanted to know whether the feedback was going to encourage this sort of longer term view of more cumulative learning and dialogue around feedback over time. So we based it on some feedback categories that had been developed by Osmond and Merry, and added a category, ipsative feedback, on recognizing progress. And these will probably all be very familiar to everyone, the kind of feedback that is used to varying extent, as Jill said, depending on the program. Praise, motivational, but can be overdone. The progress, which can be motivational as well, but also a lack of progress can be an early warning. The critique, essential information for students on how to improve it. Again, that can be discouraging or encouraging. Advice for future action, the sort of feed forward, and also questioning, asking students questions to initiate dialogue so that they think about the work themselves. And then, of course, in our tool, we had a category for unclassified statements, because there are some comments that are descriptive and don't make judgments. So what we did is we applied this analytical tool to some feedback before the we took part in the project, and then after we'd done some sort of staff developmental work on this. And we took 165 examples of written feedback from 5 programs, and went through and systematically a researcher counted the number of comments that fell into each category, and then did an average of the average comments per script for each of the categories, and then we ranked them to get a sort of very general feedback profile that we could then share with program teams. And interestingly, so before we'd done any work on the assessment careers, the overwhelmingly most dominant category of feedback was praise. So there was lots of praise. A lot of this praise didn't give students any details about why their work was good. It was just sort of motivational, well done types of comments. We then the second most dominant category was critique. Again, this didn't really surprise us. Critical comments, and we did actually subdivide this into comments that were correcting and those that were more generally critique categorizing. But anyway, overall critique came out ranked second, and then the third ranking was the advice for the current assignment mostly, rather than advice for future assignment. Again, we had a slightly we subdivided that rank. And then the sort of ipsative feedback on process was pretty much negligible, and so was the questions for clarification. So what we did, we discussed these profiles with our 5 programs, and thought about how we might want to maybe change the profile to make the feedback more usable in the long term, and particularly the advice for future assignments, and also the comments on progress were felt to be areas that could be developed. So essentially, it was used as a staff development tool. And then after the project intervention, which was to encourage students to be much more involved in the feedback process through using student response forms, afterwards we then looked at the profiles again with the same 5 programs, and did the same sort of averaging comments per script, and again, praise came out as the highest rank in the profiles. But there was what was switched round was the critique and the advice. Now, well, they were pretty much equivalent now, and now we had some evidence of comments about the students making progress, and a little bit more on the questions and clarification. But you're probably thinking, well, that doesn't really look very different. And interestingly, there was one program that had contributed to pretty well all the change, and that one program had very intensive staff development, and they had really changed their profile. But the other 4 programs had talked about it, but hadn't quite yet got to any decision about exactly, or any practical action on how they might actually shift their feedback profiles. So I think my time's run out, so I shall pass back to Jill.
Thank you very much, and I can see that you've stimulated a lot of discussion in the chat there. So I think what I'm probably going to do is just kind of skip over this next slide in the hope that we can come back to that and have some time for chat. I'd maybe just flag up that if you're interested in this topic, please also take a look at the work of the University of Dundee, who had a couple of projects. If there's a carrot to dangle to get you looking at their stuff, some of what they did in making feedback more open made for better learning, but also much greater staff satisfaction on a course that had just had its staff FTE halved. If that doesn't make you look, I don't know what will. And on to the final of today's topics, electronic assessment management, electronic management of assessment, EAM, call it what you will. One of the clearest messages from the programme was that EAM is both effective and efficient, and it's the best way to meet the needs of a very significant proportion of learners. And in using this term, I realise we're referring to a number of different processes that can often be conflated in general discussion about the approach, whether it's submission, marking, etc. And the perspectives of the various stakeholders on certain types of changes to assessment and feedback practice is a huge and very interesting topic that we addressed. And we now have a significant body of evidence about those perceptions and what might change them. The elephant in the room, as ever, is e-marking. And possibly the main point to make is that whilst you all know how polarised the for and against camps can be, there are some really interesting examples from the programme about winning over dissenters, about people who were very, very resistant to the approach, going on to champion it because they became convinced that it really did represent a significant improvement for learners and teachers. Not to dismiss any of the concerns about those who tried new approaches and found that they didn't live up to the hype, because I think we're actually at a very interesting point in relation to the technology that supports assessment and feedback and the management of it, because unlike some of the cool and whizzy things that people are innovating with in other aspects of learning and teaching, many of the available technologies have been quite clunky and poorly integrated up until now. And I think we seem to be reaching a kind of turning point where the technologies are coming of age and the new breed of products represents a significant improvement on the old. The work I would point you to here is by the University of Huddersfield. They undertook a very extensive study into electronic assessment management. They evaluated the different technologies available, and really, really recommend their report to anybody who has an interest in the topic. Having said that the suite of available technologies might not be ideal, it's clear that business processes represent a much bigger challenge. And alongside the many success stories about managing assessment, there are some cautionary tales, including a very, very honest report from the University of Exeter about why its attempt to establish end-to-end electronic processes didn't fulfill all of its objectives at the time, although has made progress since the end of the programme. And in large part, it was due to the variability of business processes in different parts of the institution. It's an issue that we heard about time and time again, and it gives concerns not just to inefficiencies in the inability to make best use of the technologies that you have, but also around the parity of experience for learners in different parts of the institution. Also, massive amount of interest in learning analytics at the moment. You need to get the business processes right to implement electronic assessment management, and you need EAM to get the kind of data that can be turned into meaningful analytics. Too big a topic to cover now, but again, refer you to the work of Huddersfield and also University of Hertfordshire, who have been doing some work on the impact on students of actually showing them some analytics data about their performance. Hertfordshire's also done some interesting work because resource management is an important part of assessment management. They've created a very useful tool called the Assessment Resource Calculator, which enables judgments about appropriate assessment methods to be viewed in the light of principles. We have with us today Julie Vuolo, and I'd like to hand over to Julie to talk about the work that they've been doing.
Hi, thanks Jill. Yes, the calculator that we developed was quite a simple tool. It just sits within an Excel spreadsheet, and it's very much that. It is a tool for academics to use when they are thinking about assessment processes, in particular thinking about the effort that goes into different types of assessment. So we set up this tool to look at a number of different assessment types, from essays, use of objective testing, presentations, looking at electronic voting systems, so objective testings with and without the use of EVS. And what we can do with the tool is plug in what we think, they're arbitrary kind of arbitrary numbers, but what we think the effort is attached to various aspects of the assessment process. So we break down the assessment into its component parts and then think about how much time is associated with everything from setting the learning outcomes to the administrative processes to the marking feedback to writing the report that goes out to the external. And when I say it's a tool, it's a flexible tool, so an academic can take the tool and they can decide what those component parts are for their particular assessment, and they can make a judgment on their own, based on their own experience as to what those timings might be. The nice thing about the tool, though, is that we can also plug into it the student numbers, and then it will do some calculations which will help us think about the effort, the time effort, in terms of that particular assessment, and we can do some comparisons then between different assessment types. So within our team, the I team, and based on our own module and our own marking, we looked, for example, at comparisons between running an essay type of assessment and doing objective testing using electronic voting systems. And what was useful about the tool was not only does it help us think about the component parts of the assessment, which we kind of think we know until we actually start to list them and break them down and try to put numbers against them, but it helped us see that in terms of essays and electronic voting, when we look at doing that with, say, around 15 students, the effort is fairly similar. But in fact, as soon as we start to move past 15 students, our numbers show us that as the student numbers go up, the effort required, and this is the academic effort rather than the student effort, but that effort, the demands continue to go up as the student numbers go up. Whereas with electronic voting systems, because most of the work is at the beginning of the assessment process in terms of preparing the multiple choice questions, even though the student numbers might go up, in fact the effort numbers stay fairly steady. So at around about, and it surprised us, only around about 15 students does that trajectory start to change. And then suddenly the technology that supports objective testing can actually pay off in terms of time efficiency, time saving. We very much recognise, though, that this tool is only one part of the process, and for us, one of our assessments for learning principles is around considering staff and student effort. So this tool may help us think about that particular issue, and it may help in when there are discussions within a program team about which assessments to pick and why, but we're very mindful that we then have to go back to all the other principles that we have and think about how they fit in too. So one little bit of a tool that fits into one little bit of the process, but very much part of a bigger picture. Thanks. I'll hand back to you then, Jill.
Thanks very much for that, Julie. And I think that was a lovely way of closing the loop back to where we started, because in all of the examples that we've heard from the individual projects today, some really interesting tools, some really interesting things going on, and they all come back to actually supporting the implementation of effective pedagogic practice and of effective learning principles. In order to try and have a little bit of time for questions, I think I'll just hand back to Lisa.
Thanks, Jill. As you can see, we've fitted in an awful lot, and as usual, there's never enough time for debate. But one thing we did want to say is, for anyone who wants to carry on for another 15 minutes, we're certainly happy to continue to be here and deal with those queries and carry on the chat. We firstly, before I finish off and go to you to questions, just wanted to get a quick idea from you that if we were to run further webinars, which would be the one in particular that you would like to know more about? And if you're able just to go back to the poll there and indicate your areas of interest, that would be wonderful. That would just give us a bit of an idea about where to focus the next one on. And I think certainly good to say that this is just a starting point for the discussions, and we'll be looking to continue them over the coming year as there's more work going on. Okay, lovely. I might just leave that there and we can come back to that in a moment. Oh, there we go. That's brilliant. Okay, so something on electronic assessment management seems to be coming up pretty high up, which is great. I just wanted to finish off quickly by just pointing you to the design studio. One of our colleagues, Roz Smith, who's with us today, has done an amazing job on pulling together all sorts of things that have come out of the programme and arranged them by themes as well as by projects. So if you go to that URL, you're going to find pretty much anything you're looking for, hopefully, and if not, get in touch. We also had a publication a couple of years ago, Effective Assessment in a Digital Age, which really provides the backbone to the programme and talks a lot about the principles approach with some case studies of all different types of technology use. So just to flag that. But most importantly, we've just launched today a series of briefings which align to the themes that we've been talking about today. You can get them all from the URLs here. You can also just go to the Jisc side and look at the advice and guidance and you'll be able to find them. And they just cover some of these themes in a little bit more depth. Okay, somebody's just asked about the recording. Yeah, of course that's going to be available and we will share that with you as well as all the URLs that we've covered. And now really over to you. Are there any outstanding questions, either in the chat box or please put your hand up if you'd like to speak. And if everyone just needs a little bit of time to reflect, that's fine. We'll just hang around with the other presenters if you have any last minute questions. Otherwise, bye everyone and thanks very much for joining us.